Never too high, never too low.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily fantasy basketball podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd and I am the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com, and you can find me on Twitter as always at redrock_bball. Another team preview podcast for you today, guys. We are going to be looking at the Phoenix Suns. Michael Bolton, he wants to hear about it.
Let's get to it.
Let's get to it indeed. To talk about the Phoenix Suns, I'm joined by one of the hosts of the Locked On Suns podcast. Evan Sidery is here with me. Evan, welcome back to the show.
Thanks again for having me, Josh. Really appreciate it.
So we're going to be talking Phoenix Suns now, who do have quite a bit of interest fantasy-wise. Some 4 or 5 guys who could project to be top 100 players on this squad for this coming season, and there are plenty of other teams that is not the case for. In terms of injuries, they look pretty okay. We had a few injuries at the end of last season, which weren't, of course, serious, and nothing seems to be too much of a problem heading into the year. So let's start with the number one guy on this team, and that is, of course, Devin Booker, who put up some really big numbers last season. He was the 21st ranked overall player in fantasy, and it wasn't a great shooting season for Booker, shooting just 33% from 3. Is there any reason why he was well down in that three-point shooting area?
I think for me, to be honest, Josh, I think it's mostly because of the team that was around him and just the role he was placed in. There was a lot of times where he was double teamed when he's come up half court, and a lot of times he'd initiate the ball come up half court. So most of his opportunities were mostly pull-up threes, where he's historically struggled from. I think he's below 30% pull-up shooter in his career, but and catch-and-shoot opportunities where I think he'll be more utilized with Ricky Rubio. He's a career near 39% on catch-and-shoot threes, which is a stark difference there. And I feel like the three should balance out to where he usually is. He won a three-point contest a couple years ago. I think if he's utilized more in an off-ball role in a situation alongside Ricky Rubio, alongside Ty Jerome, Tyler Johnson, a lot more playmakers, for example, I feel like he's going to be in a situation where he can actually thrive and really bounce back that three-point percentage up really towards probably 37-38%, I'd say.
Yeah, that's sort of the area I have him getting back to as well. And the other thing we saw with Booker's game last year is a big development in the assist numbers. Went from 4.7 to 6.8. He played a lot of point guard. I think personally that with the addition of Ricky Rubio and, as you mentioned, other ball handlers, that number might come down. Now, I want the ball in Booker's hands as much as possible. I think that's the best situation for the Suns. I wish they'd fully embrace just having him as the point guard, but I do think that we're going to see his assist numbers drop a little bit this season. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I think it's going to be – I don't think it's going to drop much, though, because, we saw a lot from Booker last year, which saw an advanced playmaker, even at his stage of the game. At 22 last year, he put up 6.8 assists per game. His potential assists were almost near 11 per game. There's so many bad teammates around him where they couldn't shoot the ball and give him good opportunities. I feel like with Rubio's presence, though, Josh, it's going to probably subside a little bit, maybe towards that 4.7 was before. I think around maybe 4.5 to 5, but like you said, I'm in the camp that I think Booker should be more a primary ball handler, and I hope the Suns can embrace that here once Ricky Rubio's contract expires in the next couple of years.
Yeah, that is obviously the best role for Booker. I see him as a second-round guy in fantasy this season, so he can get some value at ESPN where he's ranked 32. He's 18th on Yahoo, which is not far off where he is. He's sort of that mid-second round guy. It all depends. If you think he can get back to 7 assists a game, he probably jumps up to 13 to 14. If he's at 6 assists per game, he's in that 17 to 19 sort of a range. So I think we can all expect that efficiency to improve again here for Booker, and that assist is just going to be the swing thing, which might be a 5-10 spot jump in overall fantasy rankings for this coming season. A guy in his second season, Evan, is DeAndre Ayton, who put up a pretty strong season, a relatively predictably strong season. That's sort of the area we had him last year as the 41st ranked player, is where he ended the year as a third round center. That's the sort of player that you were looking for. Where does he get better this year? Now, the number one thing that I look at is he only played 30 minutes a game. So I think that's going to bump up pretty significantly. What else can he do better this year?
I think really, like you mentioned, the minutes is the big thing there. I think it's going to jump from like 33 to 34 minutes per game with the higher usage. And I think for also the usage itself, his usage percentage, I think is going to be a lot more higher than it was. I think Igor, he was a great coach for him, but with Monty Williams, he's already explained this to the local media there. He's probably going to get closer to 14 to 15, maybe 16 shots per game. He's going to be a focal point in this offense as a hub around the paint. He only averaged around 11, 12 shots per game last year. And I think that's where you're going to see more. An efficient guy who was near 60 true shooting percentage last year, one of the only rookies in NBA history, big man that put up at least 16 and 10, also on a 60 true shooting percentage. Those are some elite numbers there for a rookie big man. I think if he gets more, a couple shots per game, a couple more shots in rhythm, where we saw he put up 24 points in a quarter last year against Denver Nuggets and Nikola Jokic. If he can just be more of a focal point there, I think there's a real chance from an average, let's say, 20 points and 12 rebounds per game, to be honest.
Yeah, I've got him around 20 and 11 for this coming season. The thing that I always say holds him back from being a potential top 10 guy is the defensive numbers, is the block numbers. They did improve towards the end of last season. We saw him blocking over the final 9 games of the season, 1.3 blocks. That's an extremely small sample size, but he had a couple of multi-block games in there, but he's just not doing that on the regular basis. So keeping those blocks low is something that will hold him back. But on the flip side of that, he does generate a decent rate for steals in terms of a big man. He averaged 0.9 steals per game. That should look to increase over 1 per game. Efficiency is pretty strong, although the free throws did drop off at the end of last season. And I think at some point we hope that he's going to start taking threes and at least hitting them at a decent enough clip. Is there any indication that he's going to start taking them this season? Because last season, I believe he took exactly 4 3-point attempts.
Yeah, shockingly low there. I think when you saw him at University of Arizona, he took, I think, 18 threes in non-conference play, but then it subsided down to around 6 or 7 in conference play because he was just a bully down low at Arizona. But for Phoenix especially, I think his role with Igor was more set the screen up top and just go toward the rim. There's a lot of games, Josh, where he actually had the ball and he was wide open. Just teams would sag off him. He wouldn't look at the rim because that was his role. But I feel like DeAndre Ayton himself has talked about – Monty Williams hasn't, though, so I'll be curious to see what he does there. He's worked with Joel Embiid and Anthony Davis, who've taken at least 1 or 2 threes per game. I feel like Ayton, if he does take at least 1 or 2 threes per game, he could probably put up around 33% from 3, but his form is a little odd, so to say. He's more of a guy that uses a lot of a shot put motion, so it'll be curious to see what Ayton does in that role, because if he's able to stretch the floor there, I think it's going to not only help his own game, but his fantasy value too.
Yeah, no doubt it will help his fantasy value if that's what he is able to do, but he's got to hit them at a decent enough rate. I went on Locked On Suns earlier in the week, and we talked about if he's out there shooting them at 20%, then that actually hurts his overall fantasy value, but if he hits them at a solid enough rate, then it is an improvement in that number. It's all a bit of a balancing act there with DeAndre Ayton, but I do think that he is a pretty strong second-round center. He's ranked appropriately on Yahoo and ESPN. He's a little bit underranked on Fantrax at 38. That's too low. I think he's at that second round sort of a player for this upcoming season. They're the two guys who I think are fairly consistent and we sort of know what we're going to get. The interesting guy here is the new starting point guard. We've referenced him already. Ravitch was Quinn Snyder's system. We saw his assist numbers fall from his last 4 years in Minnesota, 8.6, 8.8, 8.7 and 9.1 assists. His 2 years in Utah, 5.3 and 6.1. Which Rick Rubio are we going to see? We're going to see this guy who plays as more of a higher usage player, less of a distributor, or back to that Minnesota day?
I think we're going to see Minnesota Rubio, to be honest. I think Monty Williams has spoke about James Jones, too. They believe he's one of the best true floor generals in the NBA, a guy who can set everyone up. And he's in a situation where I honestly feel like, to be honest, with Booker, with Ayton, with Oubre, Bridges, all these guys who can at least get a bucket for themselves, but they never had a point guard like Ricky Rubio, a guy who can set the table for him. I feel like Rubio is going to be a player who I can guarantee probably gets 7 assists per game next year, maybe closer to 8.5, because he's a guy who, I mean, he's in the situation he's in Phoenix now. He's not going to be asked to score that much. And I think that's great for him. It's going to really hide his weaknesses in Phoenix. He's a good defender. He's an all right shooter. He's not that great at it, though. If he can just be more of a focal point of a system and a cog of the system as far as playmaking goes, I think Monty Williams trusts him in that sense, and he's going to be a guy who I think maybe Booker takes some of those assists away from him a little bit, maybe gets around 1 or 2 taken away per game, but I feel like Rubio is a guy who's going to be top 10 in the league in assists per game this year.
Interestingly, his 2 years, his last couple of years in Minnesota, an 18% usage rate in each of those years. The 2 years in Utah, 24 and 23. So it was a big change in his game. He became higher usage, and that assist rate drops. And I agree that I think we'll see that assist rate rise back up, and we'll see the usage drop back off. He, to me, is one of the bigger bargain players in fantasy at the moment. 123 on ESPN. I think he's got a real chance to crack the top 60 this season. On Yahoo's at 76, so still not as big of a gap, but still I think there's some value there in Rubio, especially if you miss out on an early round point guard. Getting someone like Rubio who helps the assist, gets steals, good free throw percentage, really good rebounder. He'll hit a 3 per game as well. There's a lot of value in him there. Hey, there's a risk. Maybe those assists don't bounce back. Maybe they go with different alignments and they do start, say, Bridges and Oubre, and they put Rubio to the bench if it doesn't work out in the first month or so of the season. I don't think that'll happen, but that is a possibility. There's an element of risk there. I don't think it's too large of an element, though. Let's talk about the guy who who really shone at the end of last season after coming across in a trade for Trevor Ariza, Kelly Oubre Jr. He put up some absolutely ridiculous numbers to end last season over the final 28 games of the year. 31 minutes a night, 19 and 6 he averaged with 1.7 steals and a block. He was a top 50 fantasy player in that time. He had a 26% usage, but Evan, I think we do have to mention that a lot of those big games did come with Devin Booker on the sidelines.
Absolutely, Josh. It was an instance where he kind of was for maybe a week or so and 2 weeks of time where he would put up 30 points per game, 27, 26, and that was without Booker out there. He took over as the guy. DeAndre wasn't ready to be the number one option just yet. I don't think he was comfortable dipping his toes in that role just yet, but Oubre certainly took advantage of that, put up some monster nights. But I feel like for him this year, it's going to be more. I think he's the one who might take advantage most of Ricky Rubiro's arrival. Ricky Rubio loves to get guys out in transition, get some easy points, and Kelly Oubre is a guy who's just full of energy, loves to get down the court at a really fast pace. And I feel like he's a guy who can benefit the most from that in transition. But I expect his points per game to go down from that stint. I think it's more of a mirage what we saw that last part of the season. Probably closer, I would say, in a third role, probably around 14 points per game. And I'm really curious, though, Josh, to see if his defense maintains, because we didn't see that before in Washington. We saw it a lot in Phoenix almost every night. He was a guy who's a main defensive guy alongside Bridges, put up similar numbers to him as well. And with Dario Saric as well, with his arrival, he's not a rim protector. If DeAndre doesn't take steps forward, there's going to be a lot of pressure on Kelly Oubre to be a secondary rim protector. So really, for him, those defensive numbers might need to maintain for him to really be a focal point of this team moving forward.
He put up one of the best lines of last season, actually. His second last game of the season, he had 22 points, 4 rebounds, 2 assists, 5 steals, and 2 blocks on 57% shooting. Again, those defensive numbers, not something we ever saw from him in Washington, so that I have a level of skepticism, as I do with some of his shooting numbers. His 2-point percentage at 53% was at 46 the year before, and that increased as the season went on. His 3-point shooting still not great, only at 32%, so there is some hope there, but it's more that will he be able to maintain that high usage from the end of the season? I don't think so. And that defensive numbers, he doubled his block rate, and the steal rate was a little bit increased, but not massively. But they are two things we have to watch out for. The question I have is do you think that Oubre will start for this team?
I do. I think just with the contract they gave him, 2 years, $30 million, paying him $15.7 million this year, $14.3 the year after that. I feel like this is a trial run to see if Kelly Oubre is legitimately their starting wing of the future for the Phoenix Suns, because they're actually in Phoenix. They're hyping him up as the third piece already on billboards. I know Josh Jackson was on a billboard last year for the team with Ayton and Booker, but I feel like with Oubre, he just showed last year that he is comfortable in the role. He really vibed with the team, a young locker room that he really took over as kind of a leader all of a sudden, even though he was only 24 years old. And that's something to watch for moving forward, because it seemed like the fit from both sides is perfect from this standpoint. But I feel like from Oubre's own personal growth, he has to be a lot more efficient this year. And that's the thing with him. If he can just take less of those erratic shots where some games, Josh, he'd go 4-on-1 fast break and he just pull up a 30-foot pull-up three and clank off the rim. It's just those kind of decision-making skills and some of those lapses that I think Oubre needs to wipe out of his game a little bit. And I'll be curious to see if Monty Williams is the kind of coach that gets him out of him.
Yeah, it is important that he makes those decisions better. He's not the greatest of passers as well. That's another thing. Interestingly enough, he's only a few months older than Mikal Bridges, which I think most people, again, given how long he's been in the league, and Bridges, and he just had 1 year. They're both 23 at the moment. Oubre's turning 24 in a couple of months, but Bridges just turned 23. It's not that big a difference between those two in terms of age. I think that regardless of who starts, Oubre and Bridges, they'll both play relatively similar minutes, maybe 1 or 2 minutes difference there. So let's talk about Bridges, a guy that really showed out, especially defensively last season, showed some playmaking ability as well. But what was wrong with his shot? Why couldn't he shoot after being one of the best shooters in college the year before?
It's really weird, Josh. We've been talking about this a little bit on Locked On Suns in the past few months. And if you dive into his numbers as far as if he was wide open and if he was closely contested on threes, his closely contested threes were blowing his wide open threes out of the water, because for some reason his shooting motion, when he was wide open in the corners, so to say, he would just do like a weird hitch motion in a shot. And he didn't do that at Villanova. But when he was very closely contested, it was late in the shot clock, it'd be the normal shooting motion from Mikal Bridges. So I don't know what was going on there. Hopefully he wiped that out of his game. But I think we all know that Mikal Bridges, 40% career three-point shooter at Villanova, only shot 33% last year. I feel like he's a guy that he really should bounce back toward 40%. I mean, the 4-year sample size of Villanova, I think, counteracts that, because if he can just wipe that little hitch out of his game, I think it's more battling with himself mentally on that aspect. It's a big thing for him, though, because Bridges, he's a great defender, but his shooting is a huge aspect to his game.
The other thing that dropped off from his days at Villanova was his block rate, a really strong shot blocker. in college, and that didn't really translate to the NBA. Now, the thing is, he did play a lot of the 2 guard for Phoenix, where he's playing a lot of 3 and 4 at Villanova, so there's a bit of a change there. I think this season we see him push more back up to the 3, so maybe that helps him getting a little bit closer to the basket. Maybe he pushes to the 4 in some smaller lineups as well. So I do think that the 3-point percentage will jump up. I think that we'll also get a bit of a rise in his block numbers, and I didn't talk about Oubre, but Oubre is a real steal on ESPN in terms of ranked 155, and Yahoo is about right at 85. And Bridges 163 on ESPN still. I don't know what's going on with those numbers there. And I think he's about a borderline top 100 guy who's going to get steals. And I think he will hit those threes at a much elevated rate as opposed to where we were last season. Now, we don't have TJ Warren as the starting power forward anymore. Dario Saric comes in to be that guy from Minnesota. A little bit of a disappointing season from Saric last season. Only 25 minutes a game, came off the bench for the majority of his time in Minnesota. The 180th ranked fantasy player. Just a year before that, though, he was a top 75 guy in Philadelphia in 30 minutes a night because he was hitting threes at a really strong rate, 39%, which did drop off last season. So what are we seeing here from Saric? Is it 30 minutes a night? Is it a 25-minute-a-night role? Is he going to be getting more than that in Phoenix?
I feel like it's going to be in between that. I feel like he's going to be a 27, 28-minute per game player. And it really depends on the first month of the season, to be honest. He needs to be a player we saw in Philadelphia where he was shooting threes and really being an energetic guy on both ends. Even though he's not a great defender, he at least had the energy and the toughness to survive on that end. And in Minnesota, it was a completely different story there. I don't know if it was confidence because Dario Saric told us actually that he didn't feel like he got a correct role in Minnesota. He didn't feel like the coaches trust him enough. And with Monty Williams, he worked with him for, I believe, 2 or 3 months in an offseason as well beforehand in Philadelphia. So maybe Monty brings the best out of him there. And I think for him, it's going to be about his shot. He shot 38% throughout his career, then it dipped off for a couple months. And he's a very streaky shooter. That's the thing with Saric. And if he can be more of a playmaker, that's another interesting aspect I feel like is undeveloped yet with him because we saw in the pre-draft process in 2014, he was a guy who bring the ball up the court. He was a guy who could really initiate an offense. And we'll have to see if Monty Williams allows him to be a guy who can brings the ball up in transition, maybe get some extra assists, so to say, because he's a guy who's only averaged 2.1 assists over his career. But I feel like if he gives the free reign, so to say, from Monty, he might be a guy who averages closer to 3 assists per game this year.
Yeah, it did drop off last season. He was at 2.6 in that best season in Philadelphia. I do think that his passing hasn't really translated into good assist numbers, but he is a good passer, so that is something that could really blossom. And if he averaged 14, 6, and 4, I don't think I'd be too surprised. His lack of defensive numbers, overall lack of efficiency does hold him back a little bit in terms of value. He's ranked 125th on Yahoo, 117 on Fantrax, and 140 on ESPN. I think he can be better than that, and he's very fine as a late round pick. Maybe the upside is a little bit limited, but I still think that he is relatively solid there at that back end of your draft, knowing that there's very little in terms of who's coming in behind him to take those minutes away from him. Let's talk about a guy that came across also in a trade during last season, and that is Tyler Johnson, who played a relatively large role for this team, but it does appear that his role is going to be fairly significantly reduced this season on the last year of his exorbitantly bloated contract. We're not going to be seeing the 28-minute-a-night, 30-minute-a-night Tyler Johnson we saw last year, are we?
No, I think we're going to see closer to the Miami Heat role that he played, which is maybe at most 26 minutes per night, but more realistically with the system they have in place here with Booker playing some point guard as well at times and Rubio on board, Ty Jerome as well. Probably closer to 22 to 24 minutes per game. And the thing with Johnson, to be honest, is you have to watch for his shot. He was a very consistent shooter in Miami, but in Phoenix it dropped down to 32%. So I don't know if that was just a new team. The jitters get out of the way a little bit there. But if he can bounce back and be a good shooter, he's slated right now to be the first guard off the bench for this team. He's currently slotted as the 7th man behind Mikal Bridges. Mikal's going to be the 6th man there. I feel like him and Mikal are going to get a lot of minutes there, but there's a real opportunity, I feel like, that Tyler Johnson with his $19.2 million contract, there's a real good opportunity he's going to be traded midseason because they drafted Ty Jerome. They traded their 2020 Milwaukee pick for Ty Jerome and his rights. And I feel like they're setting themselves up maybe to groom Ty Jerome for the first few months of the season, and then maybe Tyler Johnson shipped off at the deadline there.
Yeah, I don't see Tyler Johnson playing a huge role this season. I think low 20s is about right, and I think that risk of a trade is absolutely huge for him, and even whatever team he goes to, I don't think he's going to be playing a large enough role to make him a worthwhile fantasy guy. For some reason, he's being drafted at 152 on Yahoo. You shouldn't be looking at him there maybe as a top 200 sort of a player, but again, limited minutes, and a guy who does struggle, doesn't generate many assists, doesn't generate, not a good rebounder, not a very high steals guy, an inefficient player. There's not a lot to love about Tyler Johnson from a fantasy point of view? Now, you've mentioned this bloke's name quite a bit so far today. Let's talk about Ty Jerome, who they did trade for to get that draft pick. I don't see Jerome playing a huge amount this season, especially early on, but you seem to have a different view of that. This team's got about 20 point guards now, by the way, as well. We're back to those old days.
Yeah, it's crazy. They go from like 4 to 0. Now we're back up to like 6 or 7, which is just the roller coaster of Phoenix Suns, so to say. But I feel like Ty Jerome is a guy who's going to not play much at all. He might be a DNP CD the first few months of the season, but I feel like from every indication that I've heard and from their roster construction as well, that he's going to be eventually the backup point guard to Ricky Rubio, whether it's in February or before that, because they seem super high on him. I've heard a lot about him really dominating in workouts with the team so far. He's doing really well in that sense. So maybe he pushes for an earlier role than we all expect there. And I think Ty Jerome is a guy. He's a lights-out shooter. He shot 40% over his career at Virginia, and he's a guy who's a very good assist player. Monty Williams mentioned he thought he was the best player in the pick and roll this past year, even over Ja Morant, which I don't know if I believe that or not as far as pick and roll passers. But they seem super high on Ty Jerome. They gave up that first-round pick for him. I think second half of the season, that's where you can find a lot of value with Ty Jerome, but not really early on, I think.
The thing that does stand out about Jerome, you mentioned it, is the assist numbers, and that can always be really valuable in fantasy. Think of guys that can come in, like a JJ Bray, I always reference him, but someone who plays 20 minutes and gets 4.5 assists per game, that can be really useful in a fantasy context. So Jerome, I guess, is a name to watch there. Javon Carter's also on the roster, Ali Okobo, Jalen LeCue, so there's just a lot of point guards in there. I do imagine Jerome will be that third guy. I think they've given up the idea in Phoenix here that anyone who wasn't drafted by this front office must be removed immediately unless their name is Devin Booker is a weird thought process, but that seems to be the way they're going. Already shipping off DeAnthony Melton, and Ali Okobo looks to be on the outs, even though I thought he showed some signs last season, but he doesn't appear to be in that mix at this point, does he?
No. He's a guy who's the 15th player on this roster, I imagine. Maybe him and Javon Carter are fighting for that last spot. Jalen LeCue is going to be a guy in the G League throughout the season, but you hit it around the money there, Josh. If you were drafted by Ryan McDonough, you're not going to be on this team for very long. Okobo is the only other player outside of Ayton, Booker, and Bridges who's still on this team who was technically drafted by Ryan McDonough. And they were trying to shop Okobo this summer. They couldn't find any takers. And he's a guy who I think is just going to ride on the bench for a little bit this season. Maybe he gets traded alongside a guy like Tyler Johnson midseason. But they definitely supplanted him with Ty Jerome as their backup point guard of the future.
Let's talk about Jalen LeCue, a guy that we didn't see in college, undrafted but signed to a 4-year deal, 2 years guaranteed, and showed some real pop in summer league. He's obviously a few years away, but what can we look to him as terms of where do the Suns view him as a long-term prospect?
Yeah, long term, I think they actually view him within the next 2 or 3 years. He might be their backup point guard or a backup 2 guard, because he is a guy, like you mentioned, he showed himself in summer league, even though he was 18 years old, 19 years old. He's a good defender. He's a very smart player, which I found very surprising from going from straight from high school to the summer league scene. He actually proved himself really well there, and that's a very good sign moving forward. For this year, though, I think he's going to be a player in the G League all season, maybe even next year, too. He's a guy it's the first time that the Suns are really using their G League correctly under James Jones, and that's going to be a real case study for them to follow this year, is how Jalen LeCue develops in Northern Arizona. But long term, I think there's a real possibility that they believe that he could be a third or fourth guard off the bench, maybe gives you a couple 10, 15 minutes per game here in the next couple of years.
Yeah, so he's an interesting guy just to watch in that respect in terms of long term. Think of a guy like Anthony Simons, an unknown player but with a ton of athleticism, and that can develop. Now, a couple of the other guys they brought in this off-season period who look like they're going to play rotation minutes. We'll start, of course, with Aaron Baines, who looks to be the backup center behind DeAndre Ayton. Baines is just going to play that 17-minute, 18-minute a night role. Do you think there's any chance? Now, last season we saw it with Kokoshkov that there were times that Rashawn Holmes would get minutes over DeAndre Ayton and play above him. Do you think there's any chance that happens with Baines, or is Monty Williams going to be like Ayton's getting his 33 a night unless there's some sort of extreme foul trouble?
Yeah, unless Ayton gets in severe foul trouble or if he gets hurt, I'm never going to see probably Aaron Baines get more minutes or above DeAndre Ayton this year, because even if we compare him real quick to Rashawn Holmes for a second, Holmes actually gave you blocks. He gave you a lot of rebounds per game. Baines, though, he's not going to be that defensively, I don't think. And really his main value is his three-point shot, which is a little inconsistent sometimes. I think he's going to let it fly a little bit more this year, though. So maybe he can get you some help there. But I feel like Aaron Baines will play maybe 14, 15 minutes per game. He was really traded for to really help mentor DeAndre, and they thought Rashawn Holmes wasn't a good mentor for him, just to get a veteran there, a guy who can really be a tough player, help really toughen up DeAndre Ayton, so to say. That's really what they were going for with Aaron Baines. And I feel like outside of that veteran role and maybe getting some rebounds and some three-point shots up there, he won't really be a guy who is relied on that much.
Let's talk about Frank Kaminsky, who was also signed in free agency. Is he likely to be a rotation guy immediately?
Yeah, I think so. I think he's going to play around 15 minutes per game. It's going to be interesting, though, because they brought in Cheick Diallo from New Orleans, who's going to play the exact same position as him. We'll have to see. It might be a camp battle between those two guys, to be honest, because it seems like everything's wide open outside of starting spots right now. And I feel like Kaminsky, though, his shooting value is going to be big for this because he'll be a player who can play the 5 and also play the 4. That's where he's currently slotted right now behind at the 4 spot, which I think is a super interesting way of going about it. He was really wasn't used much in Charlotte at the very end of there. If he can actually hit some threes, he's going to play the Dragan Bender role in Phoenix, where he's going to be just a stretch 4, maybe a stretch 5 in small ball lineups there. I think he's going to play early on in the season at least 15, 20 minutes per game. And if he doesn't prove himself, it might dwindle off pretty quickly after that.
Yeah, look, he's not much of a fantasy option, but I do think he will be in that rotation immediately here for this team. You mentioned Diallo as well, who is a much better fantasy player than what Kaminsky is, with his ability to block shots, and he can score a bit, rebound a bit, get some steals. But yeah, he fighting into that role is something that we have to watch. But of course, if he is ever forced into a larger role, Diallo, he is someone that you do need to pay some attention to. We haven't talked about the guy who was the Suns' first overall pick, or first pick in this year's draft, a surprise pick to everybody, including, I'm sure, you, Evan, Cameron Johnson. We didn't get to see him in Summer League. He is, as everybody knows, quite a bit older than your regular rookie, dealt with some hip problems. A, should we be concerned about the injuries? And B, is he going to be slotted in as, let's say, 4th guard immediately?
Yeah, I think injuries is a really interesting thing to watch. I know Johnson said to us, and I know Monty has said this to us as well, that his correction of his hips before in North Carolina was more just a thing where he thought it would improve his performance. It wasn't so much so an injury, but I'm cautious there. I'll be curious to see how he handles some real NBA minutes against NBA competition. But he's a sharpshooter. He's a guy who's going to give you probably 40% from 3. I imagine maybe if it's NBA line, maybe he goes 38% or something like that. But I think he's a player who they really trust right now. They're bringing these high IQ rookies, even close to, they're older than Devin Booker. That's just how crazy how young Booker is. And with Cam Johnson, I think he's going to be actually the backup 2 guard to Devin Booker, even though he is 6'9" and 6'8.5". He's a player who's going to be getting those backup 2 minutes behind Devin Booker. Might be a guy he's very versatile. That's what James Jones told us as well. He's going to play not only the 2, but also the 3 and the 4 in some lineups. I don't know about the 4 that much because I probably can't survive against front-court players, but I imagine his role maybe be like a mini version of JJ Redick, because I think he's a guy who can extract a lot of value running around screens, maybe getting some open looks. I think he's going to play maybe not much early on, but I think mid-season if he proves himself, I think he's going to average around 20 to 25 minutes per game.
That's interesting. I do think he's going to be a rotation guy. I didn't have him as playing that many minutes a night, but that is something, again, that could move up, especially if Tyler Johnson is out as the season moves along. I don't think he's going to provide much from a fantasy point of view apart from hitting threes. That can be useful. We saw that with someone like Landry Shamet last season, but Johnson's going to need 20-plus minutes to actually have an impact in your league in that area. And for some reason, ESPN has him ranked at 145. That's a ridiculous ranking. Yahoo's also ridiculously ranked him at 625, which of course both of those are way off the mark as to where Cameron Johnson is likely to end up for this coming season. Evan, I reckon that covers all of these players that we need to talk about here. I'm just going to talk some quick value and bust guys. I think that Rubio at 123 on ESPN is a great value pick, and I think, again, Cam Johnson at 145, 22 spots below Rubio, is ridiculously high for someone who's going to be playing such a limited role. So I don't think that he should be looked at being drafted in any sort of standard league. Evan, thank you for jumping on the podcast, talking Suns with me. Let everyone know where they can find you over on Twitter.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks again for having me, Josh. You can follow me over on Twitter at Eastside. You can also follow our Locked On Suns Twitter page at Locked On PHX Suns, and you can follow us as well on any iTunes or streaming platforms you have. So thanks again for having me, Josh.
Not a problem, Evan. Thanks for jumping on with me. All right, and that'll wrap it up for today's podcast. Subscribe to this podcast, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and on Spotify. And on YouTube, give me a thumbs up, leave a comment, all that great stuff below. Make sure you hit the bell so you never miss an episode as well. Follow me on Twitter at redrock_Beeble, Instagram, Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya. Ricky Rubio.